So this is now me mixing up a little palette for this painting. I'm going to use some turquoise, mix it in a little bit with yellow to create a nice greeny turquoisey effect on one side. And then I'm also using some Viridian green here, which I'm going to warm up. I'm putting a bit of linseed oil with it just to give it a little bit more flexibility. And I'm going to put some yellow with it just to warm it up a little bit because it does, and some ultramarine. First cool it down, then warm it up with some yellow and give it a nice friendlier sort of palette. And these colors, and I've got my ultramarine there, and okay, whoopsie. Right now, what I'll do first of all is just darken the bottom side there, the blues, with the ultramarine, with some nice darker tones, because I want to work in this painting on more tones and highlights and darks and lights, and take it to the next level so that it can actually really just relax now for the next 2 weeks. And then I will start, I'll do the final session. So here I'm just putting in some textures, adding some ultramarines and greens to make these little areas slightly more interesting from a textural point of view. Quite freely applying the paint and then just refining it a little bit, softening it up. I'm not going to film the whole process. I've edited this video quite strongly just to bring out the most important parts of it. So I've confined it into about 10 minutes. And here I'm just adding some areas where I want the actual highlight and focal point of the painting to be. So this is going to be sort of the eye of the painting, you can call it that if you may. So I'm just putting down some rough whites here, nice thick oil. And I'll soften them a little bit later, just not too fussy at this stage. Just put things down and let it settle nicely for the final session in about 2 weeks' time. Then I'll complete it. But this whole exercise is mostly about tonal values and colors as such, and to create the final interest and to come close to resolving the painting. Plotting areas where I want certain colors to come out, so I'm putting some greens in there, for instance, some whites, just to create some interest and a variation in tone and color. And all this color, this paint is mixed with quite a generous amount of linseed oil, so that it does eventually settle with and the weeks it's going to sit now, just settle in nicely and blend in as the oil will do on its own. So here I'm also adding a slightly warmer green in some areas. And now here I'm softening the paint a little bit just by gently playing with a brush and then doing some linear work to define the areas and to separate them and to create a certain amount of clarity and interest, of course, because sort of tidying up, and the line does tend to give it some more depth and clarity and interest, and as it settles and blends in, it does also blend in the tones and create lovely subtleties that I cannot possibly do with a brush. These things happen in time, and that's actually going to be the focal point of the painting, there where that little spiral is. So they just add some tonal values in there with a little brush, very, very softly, and put a nice big blob of white paint there to really bring out the highlight, so that won't move, that will stay. Now this area was, in the previous session I had quite a few runs here, like hairline runs, thin ones, which I like as for the painting, but I just found it was a bit too dull and similar in color. So I've added some blues in there, which I'm going to rub into the painting, so it creates a kind of a purpley stain almost as it blends in. That's a nice thing with the underpainting being dry, so nothing moves. So I can really manipulate it now as I please. And I work with it, with the cloth of course. And now that I've created that, with a smaller brush I can actually really start defining little areas with a fine brush line. And also by going over these little runs or hairpin things, it almost creates another dimension of depth. It pushes the runs back again, so that it looks almost like oh, whatever, stone, it gives it a lovely texture, for instance. And yeah, makes it more three-dimensional, I would say. And I'll just soften it again with a dry brush in areas, the line as I please, as I find it's necessary. And here, for instance, you can see the runs. Now, if I go over it with a brush and create the other dimension, it's almost as if it's sunken into, like you would find in stone or whatever. Although this is not stone I'm painting, but it gives you that three-dimensionality and pushes it back. And in some areas here, I feel I need a little bit more definition, so I can just move it in with a brush and do some line work, which I will then soften, and it will create a nice area of interest when it dries properly, as the linseed oil in the oil paint settles and moves around once it's drying. Because you can see those little hairline runs, they all settled in after I'd done session 2. So slowly as it dried in time. Now this area here was also very dull and boring. I wanted to give it some darker tones. So I first initially gave it some ultramarine blue with some black in it, of course. I'm going to put some brown over the blue to blend in nicely. And then dab it with a cloth to give it some texture. And still the paint is very wet with the linseed oil. I'm using dry paint here at all. So just quite generously and roughly put on the burnt sienna, and then with a cloth dab it, pull it, create a lovely texture. Let some of the whites from underneath come through as well, and dab it nicely. See there, and then with a dry brush I soften the whole thing a little bit more and give it some more dark tones. I think it needs a little bit more dark. So go over that so the stuff from underneath is shining through and the new darks are creating a very lovely texture. And here, for instance, now I think I'm going to add a little bit of, leave that. And there's some opposite lines for some nice tension to come through and play around with it. And here I'll just add some turpentine on the brush there, let it run again to create a little bit of a strange, interesting texture. And again do the same and work quite freely and quite spontaneously at this stage. This is all with linseed oil, putting it on, going over the previous marks to create more interest and depth, and working with the turpentine that I've put on as run. So then I just take the cloth and work with a brush, and certain areas just define that I want that white to stick out a little bit more, to be more pronounced. So I just put the edge of a line, it does to help to separate it and to create a nice clarity in that particular area. Here again I wanted to darken this area, so I'm just using here the burnt sienna with black with linseed oil, and I will then just work quite roughly and loosely, let it run, because later I will dab it with a brush. Just work completely freely and use quite a lot of medium, because the medium here is quite important, otherwise it becomes too stiff. It has to run and be free and like little rivers and do its own thing. And just now I will control it more with the cloth and the brush and pull it back again. But for now just add it on quite liberally. Let it run, be wild. Now bring in the cloth and just dab it, soften it, and then with the dry brush again just blend it in nicely, then let it dry, of course. And here again those runs you see, just with a cloth and a brush, work into it, let it run its own thing, and then work into it later. Gives you a nice natural finish, unexpected, which is nice, what I'm looking for. And this area I found it was a little bit color was a bit dull, so I'm just going to put a bit of turquoise right on the edge with a whole lot of linseed oil, so it will settle over the next 2 weeks and create some nice little textures. As you can see, I'm quite liberal there with the linseed oil, although the light does exaggerate it a little bit, and just pull it across some, then let it do its own thing over time. Now the final middle point of the area, this is where the accent's going to be, and this is what I've landed up with. And I shall now let this painting relax for a while, and I will finish it in the next session. This is almost finished, it's 3/4 all the way done. So as usual, I rotate it and let it go to sleep, and I shall revisit you again in 2 weeks' time. Okay, so that's it for this session. Thank you for watching.